Isan Mrs. Здравствуйте. Greetings from the Warner School of Education at the University of Rochester in Rochester, New York, United States of America. My name is Martin Lynch. I am very pleased and very honored to be able to speak with you today in the context of the 7th International Forum on Teacher Education, on the topic of supporting student motivation, well-being, and success in a time of extremes. I want to begin by saying that although I will be delivering my talk in English, many of my slides will also include text in Russian. And I will be happy to take questions in English or in Russian after the presentation. I will be dividing my talk into 3 parts. First, what's the problem? What are we learning about it? And is there a solution? Specifically, I want to take a brief look at the impact of the pandemic on students, their teachers, and parents. Then I want to present some key research findings from several countries. And lastly, I want to offer some thoughts about what we can do to help students, and I think their parents and teachers as well. We all remember that fateful day in March of 2020 when the World Health Organization declared this a global pandemic. We all know what happened. Schools closed, teaching and learning were changed abruptly from in-person to fully online. But what has been the impact on our students, and what's been the impact on their networks of support? Researchers and practitioners around the world have been asking this very question, and the findings are clear and they are stark. Many students struggle with structuring their day, whereas before teachers and classrooms provided the structure for them. Many students are struggling with getting started in the morning. And again, previously, the school did this for them by its schedule. Many are struggling with focusing on their schoolwork. These are problems of motivation, and they're problems in concentration and attention. Other researchers around the world have called attention to notable increases in stress, anxiety, and physical illness among students. And here I wish to call attention to a study by Aristovnik and colleagues, which looked at about 30,000 students from 62 different countries around the world during the spring of 2020. Results found notable increases in feelings of boredom, anxiety, frustration, as well as worries about the future, about their careers, and about their studies. So these truly are global problems among our students. Researchers and practitioners point out that students have been forced to learn in a completely new and unfamiliar way. Many students are falling behind. Many are experiencing various deficits in their learning. And there is a widening impact of existing inequalities among students. For example, various socioeconomic backgrounds, various disabilities. And these gaps widen during the summer. But while we are focusing on the impact of the pandemic on students, let's not forget that students are part of a learning ecosystem that includes their parents, who are their caregivers, as well as their teachers. A basic principle of systems thinking is that if you affect one member of a system, you affect all members of that system. And so we ask, how has this whole learning ecosystem of students, parents, teachers been affected by the pandemic? I strongly believe in the value of theory in helping us to think a little bit more clearly about complicated and difficult questions. And one theory that I think speaks very powerfully to our current situation is self-determination theory, or SDT as it's known. Now, The beginnings of self-determination theory go back to the work of Edward Deci and Richard Ryan in the 1970s and 1980s, and their work got started at my home university, the University of Rochester. But today it includes a truly global community of scholars. A key distinction that SDT makes really has to do with the quality of motivation that people have for their various activities. And so our motivation for a given activity can either be more internal, in which case I'm acting for reasons that are intrinsic because I'm interested in or enjoy the activity because it's important to me personally. Or our motivation for a given activity can be more external, in which case I'm acting for reasons that are extrinsic, because I want to gain a reward or perhaps avoid a punishment, or because I somehow feel forced or pressured to act. Some 30 to 40 years of empirical research, including in the domain of education, has shown that internal motivation is associated with better outcomes, including persistence, enjoyment, performance, and well-being. SDT also tells us that motivation can change. It can move along a continuum from more external at one end to more internal or more autonomous at the other end. Importantly, our motivation responds to the surrounding climate, the social context. When we experience that context as more controlling, more pressuring, our motivation tends to become more external in that domain. If I do act, in other words, I will do so out of a feeling of pressure. But when we experience the context as more autonomy supportive, as giving us more choices, options, freedom to act, then our motivation in that context tends to become more internal, more autonomous. So this, of course, leads us to the question of what kinds of environment tend to promote more internal motivation. And here I want to introduce another important concept of self-determination theory, basic psychological needs. Basic needs are the things that we require for growth, integration, internalization, and well-being. This is the general model supported by over 30 years of research by the SDT community. And at this point, this model has considerable cross-cultural support, including in the domain of education. Now, I wanted to find out what kind of research has been done during this past year of the global pandemic, specifically in terms of the impact on students and their networks of support. And so I reached out to the global community of SDT researchers. And I want today to share with you what SDT researchers in 3 countries have been investigating and learning: in Russia, in Israel, and in Germany. I'll give you a quick hint. We're going to see how paying attention to the basic psychological needs of students, of teachers and parents is going to be very important indeed. Now, I want to start with a series of studies conducted by Tamara Gordeeva and her colleagues in Russia. Dr. Gordeeva invited me to attend her participation a few weeks ago, and with her permission, I share briefly some of the key findings of the research she and her colleagues have been conducting. Now, the first question that Gordeeva and colleagues looked at was the question of student motivation during a time of remote learning. Specifically, what types of students would display a preference for online versus face-to-face learning. Data were gathered during the fall of 2020 from schools across Russia, but not in Moscow. Both 5th graders and 8th graders were sampled from both face-to-face classrooms and remote classrooms. Measures included scales to assess students' academic motivation, their engagement in learning, as well as various measures of student well-being. What did they find? Well, students who expressed a preference for online learning tended to be those who were unmotivated or who had low autonomous motivation and low engagement. They tended to be those who had negative associations with the school and who tended to have negative peer relationships. That kind of makes sense if you think about it, right? These are the students who would prefer not to be in the classroom at school. Now, a second study looked at teens in Moscow. again asking who preferred online learning. So there were students in Moscow, 6th to 8th graders, who had spent the past year learning online. Students were asked about their attitudes towards learning, their motivation, their grit and tendency to cheat, their relationship with the teacher, their basic needs satisfaction in the classroom, and various measures of psychological well-being. Analyses were performed through structural equation modeling. Well, what did they find? First, basic need satisfaction in the classroom was associated with greater internal motivation, which in turn was associated with greater satisfaction with school in general, but with a less positive attitude toward online learning. Okay. Now, in contrast, students who were amotivated for school showed more positive attitudes toward online learning. Now, the second finding is that reporting a positive relationship with the teacher was associated with greater school satisfaction and with greater grit. And greater grit, in turn, was associated with a lower tendency to cheat. Now, it's worth noting that greater internal motivation was also associated with greater grit. Now, in a third study, Gardeva and colleagues asked students views on the advantages and disadvantages of online learning. They were asking about the questions, what's bad in their experience about online learning, what gets in the way of learning, and also what advantages are there potentially. And here they looked at university students and collected qualitative responses, tapping students' views about their experiences of online learning. Again, during the year that followed the start of the pandemic. What did they find? Difficulty concentrating, poor working conditions at the home, internet problems, cognitive isolation, social isolation and alienation, exhaustion from sitting in front of a screen for hours at a time. Probably feels familiar to many of us. On the brighter side, students pointed out that at least they didn't have to go anywhere. Some even reported better concentration. Students who were more introverted felt that participating online was actually easier for them than when in person. And some expressed that there's always the opportunity to review something that you didn't catch the first time around. So the work of Gardeva and colleagues really is confirming students' motivation and engagement during online learning are critical factors. And their motivation and engagement are precisely what many students are struggling with, even though there were both advantages and disadvantages to online learning that students themselves were calling attention to. Well, for some ideas on how to support student motivation and engagement, let's turn now to the research from Israel being conducted by Naama Gershi and Edith Katz. Prior research shows that an autonomy supportive teaching style improves student engagement. And research also shows that teacher self-efficacy improves student engagement. Now, we know that the role of the parent in the child's learning has increased dramatically as a result of the COVID-related shutdown of schools. And so that leads us to ask the question whether the parent-teacher relationship has also taken on new importance. And that's the question that Gershi and Katz set out to test in their research. So they administered a survey to homeroom teachers during the spring of 2020. Teacher measures included a measure of teacher support. In other words, what kind of support did teachers receive from the school administration? What kind of support did they receive from their colleagues? Teacher needs satisfaction and frustration. To what extent did teachers feel that their own basic psychological needs were being satisfied? A measure of teaching style, which included 15 vignettes capturing teacher motivational style as more autonomy supportive, more controlling, more chaotic. Teacher efficacy vis-a-vis engaging students, their instructional strategies, classroom management, things like that. The parent-teacher relationship, including the perceived quality of that relationship, and also actions that the teacher took proactively to reach out and engage parents. And then lastly, measure of student engagement in remote learning process. And this is the teacher's perception of student motivation and engagement. Analyses were conducted using structural equation modeling. What did they find? Well, the support that teachers experienced from school administration and colleagues enhanced teachers' own need satisfaction. Teachers' need satisfaction in turn enhanced teachers' efficacy, their autonomy supportive teaching style, and their ability to create and maintain positive relationship with the parents. However, although in traditional face-to-face classrooms, teacher efficacy and teaching style have a great impact on student engagement, this was not the case during a time of remote learning. Indeed, the impact of these factors on student engagement was fully mediated through the quality of the parent-teacher relationship. And this was true regardless of the family's socioeconomic status or the student's grade level. Now, I'll talk more about the implications of this study later, but for now I point out that it emphasizes how important the parent-teacher relationship has become during a time of extremes. SDT researchers in Germany have also been investigating the important role of parents in supporting the motivation and well-being of students during a time of remote learning. Specifically, Andreas Neubauer and colleagues have been asking whether parents providing autonomy support for their children during the pandemic can promote the child's daily well-being and positive behavior, can improve the family climate, and can improve even the parents' own well-being. Now, these are very relevant questions, I would suggest, again, given the increased importance of parents' role during this pandemic. Baseline measures included, they conducted a daily diary study from March to April of 2020, and baseline measures included child behavior, including the strengths and difficulties questionnaire, emotional problems, hyperactivity and attention, prosocial behavior, family environment, parent well-being, including stress and vitality. And daily measures included measures of autonomy supportive parenting, child well-being based on positive and negative affect, and parents' own need fulfillment. And analyses were conducted by structural equation modeling and multi-level modeling. And what did they find? Well, they found that when parents support their child's autonomy, again, autonomy is about making choices, taking an initiative, pursuing one's own interests. When parents supported the child's autonomy, the parents themselves experienced greater need fulfillment. The child's well-being was greater, and the parents' well-being showed improvement over 3 weeks. And they also reported greater family cohesion, okay? And importantly, when children experienced greater well-being, this led to improvements in various internalizing and externalizing problems, and also promoted more prosocial behavior on the child's part in the home. So we've seen how the research is showing that students struggle with motivation, attention, and concentration during a time of online learning. Their well-being suffers, but that teachers and especially parents play an important role in supporting their students during this time of extremes. What can we do to help? Now, I want to call attention again to the finding from Israel about the critical role played by teachers and parents in student motivation and engagement during the unusual circumstances created by the pandemic and the forced sudden switch to online learning. With that finding in mind, here are some recommendations. First and foremost, support the supporters. Teachers and parents are students' primary supporters during this time of extremes, when so much of students' learning has taken place online. But teachers and parents also need to feel supported too. And so what kind of support could teachers use? Well, teachers may, of course, need technical support. Okay, again, we're talking about the use of technology to conduct learning remotely. They may need pedagogical support from experts and peer groups, providing solutions and ideas and ongoing feedback on the use of technology and best practices in pedagogy. It's important to acknowledge the incredible stress that teachers are under and to convey that acknowledgement to them, providing opportunities for emotional consultation and peer support. Okay, we may need to involve appropriate mental health professionals even and make those resources available to teachers. And building meaningful collaboration with parents, of course, requires time, energy, and resources. And so it may be important to allocate time each day for parent-teacher communication. Now, remember that supporting teachers translates into supporting parents, and supporting parents, who we have learned play an even more important role during these times of crisis, translates into supporting students' motivation and engagement for learning. Now, again, 40 years of research conducted by members of the SDT community around the world emphasizes the important role played by providing supports for students' basic psychological needs. Those needs include, once again, the needs for autonomy, for relatedness, and for competence. When students experience satisfaction of these needs in the classroom, they are more likely to be internally motivated, more engaged in the learning process. They enjoy learning more. They persist at their learning tasks longer. Their academic learning outcomes are better. And very importantly, their emotional, psychological well-being is better. Given all of the stresses and strains of living in a time of pandemic, a time of extremes, I would suggest that attending to students' psychological, emotional well-being is no less important than paying attention to their motivation for learning or to their academic outcomes. Now, I'll go through these next slides fairly quickly. In a broad sense, of course, we want to help especially children who may be at risk. And to the extent that learning must take place online, we need to arrange circumstances so that all students have a chance to succeed. And to that end, here are some suggestions for supporting students' basic needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness in the classroom, whether online or face-to-face. So we might think of ways to create an interactive learning format, making use of discussions, debates, the idea of the flipped classroom, which we can talk more about as well. An important reason to promote interaction among students, especially during online learning, is to avoid what some have called the black box dilemma. Students on screen in their little boxes, but often who have their camera turned off, right? And we don't even know if they're truly present, let alone interacting with their peers in a constructive learning environment. So how can we deal with that? Get students engaging not only with the instructor, but with each other, okay? Self-determination researchers have found that teachers can do a lot to create a climate in the classroom that can support or conversely undermine students' psychological needs. The way that we speak is so important. Can we communicate in ways that support student autonomy and choice? Or do we convey by our words that we want to push and control our students towards some predetermined outcome of our instructional choosing? Well, what are some creative ways to support students' needs for competence during online learning? Remember that the kind of feedback we provide students can either support or undermine their feelings of mastery. Can we create online tasks that provide students informational feedback? And here I mean providing students with diagnostic information that will help them understand their weak points and how to become more effective, rather than providing controlling feedback. In other words, feedback which criticizes, compares, and pressures students toward predetermined outcomes. Here are some suggestions for supporting students' basic needs for relatedness. Expressing enthusiasm, truly conveying that I, as the teacher, see each student in the classroom, each individual student. Enthusiasm, of course, is infectious. Feeling seen means feeling valued, important, recognized. All the more challenging to find ways to convey that during a time of remote learning, of course, but it's so important. Can I, as teacher, convey my optimism, my hope, my care for each student and for their well-being? Can I, in my classroom, whether online or face-to-face, create a culture of care rather than a culture of accountability? Now, in light of the research that's been conducted during the pandemic in Germany, for example, and in Israel and other countries, it's important to keep in mind the role played in the children's motivation and well-being by the type of parenting they experience in home. Whether parents are more autonomy supportive or controlling, there are a host of benefits for children in the home of autonomy supportive parenting. And importantly, the research shows that when parents' own needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness are met, they are more likely in turn to be autonomy supportive toward their children. Now, it may not be within the school's scope of responsibility or even ability to support parents in this way, but I think it's important to keep in mind that we're talking about a whole system, a learning ecosystem that includes child, parent, and teacher. And not to forget how important the role of the parent has become, especially during this time of extremes. Parents are taking on a whole new set of roles and responsibilities, not to mention stressors. And to the extent that we can be mindful of parents' need for need satisfaction, we will also be serving the developmental and educational needs of the student as well. Now, I want to take this moment to point out that with 6 of my colleagues from the Warner School of Education, we will be presenting a special session during this forum, IFTE 2020, on our approach to teacher preparation and learning during a time of extremes. In particular, my colleague, Dr. Karen Mackey, will be talking about the important role of school counselors in helping students to adapt, adjust, and flourish in these challenging times. I encourage you to join us. At this point, I just want to say thank you, and I welcome your questions in English or in Russian. Можете на русском. Спасибо вам большое.